All right, so today we're going to be talking about parts of a flower. We've been talking about plant reproduction, and we've talked about how there's sexual reproduction in plants where they use pollen to fertilize an egg. And then we also talked about asexual reproduction where maybe they shoot out a stem or a root, something else that ultimately has the same DNA as the original plant. So they're making a clone. So in order to talk about sexual reproduction, where we have pollen going and landing on another flower, we have to learn about all of the parts of the flower because we need a part of the flower that makes the eggs. We need a part of the flower that makes the pollen. So we're going to talk about the parts of a flower. So first thing I have here is a little video clip, and we're going to take a look at this. And it is a time lapse of a flower. So as soon as this loads, I'm going to mute the music here, but these are flowers that are going and blooming. I know it's a little bit choppy here, but you get the idea. And look at some of these different parts. So notice how when we start a flower, before it blooms, it's got kind of these protective green things around it. When it blooms, it has all these beautiful petals that are blooming. Again, I know it's a little bit choppy, but we're using this to take a look at our different flower plants or our different flower parts. So now that we know, let's take a look. So in that video, you saw some green stuff around the flower. Those green parts are going to be protecting the flower from like frost or from any damage before the flower actually opens up. And they have a name. They're called sepals. And they're leaf-like, they're like leaves, and their one job is to protect the bud, the flower, before it actually opens. Eventually, they'll go kind of below the petals, and you won't really see them or notice them after the flower blooms. Now, the job of the petals, you'll notice that flowers have lots of different colors, shapes, sizes of petals, and that's because their job is to attract pollinators. So bees and birds and insects that are going to come and get nutrition from that flower. They're going to get sugar, nectar from that flower, and in the process, they're going to bump into some of that pollen, and when they go to the next flower, they're going to carry that pollen to the next flower. So the reason that flowers make themselves brightly colored is so that those insects and those pollinators can find them. So if you don't have this drawing, you can either do a really rough sketch of this in your notebook, or you can grab it from me later when you return. But we're just going to label petal and sepal on our little diagram here. So we also have to talk about the different structures that help reproduction happen inside of a flower. So they've named flower parts male and female because they produce sperm and egg. Now, I understand flowers are not necessarily males or females, and again, they're existing in this binary one or the other, and we know there's a lot of gray area in nature. But for our purpose, we're going to say it's the male structure. And the reason we say it's the male structure is because it produces sperm. The sperm of the plant is called the pollen. So the stamen here, we're going to label the whole stamen in a second, but the whole stamen is this whole part right here. So the anther is on the top. The anther is going to produce pollen. So it's making that pollen. So if you're like allergic to pollen, that's the part you don't like. And pollen is the plant sperm. So it's making those little grains of pollen. And then we have this stalk that holds up this anther so that it's high enough that our pollinators and that our wind can kind of blow it around. And that's called the filament. So this whole thing is the stamen. That whole thing is this male structure. Now, we're going to learn that some flowers only have male structures. Some flowers only have female structures. Some flowers have both. So this flower has both male and female structures. Sometimes that means they can pollinate themselves. Sometimes it means they still need to pollinate another flower. They can't actually pollinate themselves. So then again, our reminder here, our pollen is our plant sperm. So we know that in sexual reproduction, we need sperm and an egg. Okay, so we need the structures that are going to produce that egg now. So let's look at the female part. This whole entire thing is called the pistil, the whole middle part here. Inside this entire female part, we have the ovary at the bottom. The ovary is just the big part at the base, and the ovary is going to have our eggs in it. Now, we looked yesterday or the other day at what is a fruit. Well, we're going to learn that when this ovary and the eggs inside of it, if they get fertilized, the whole ovary turns into the fruit. So when you're eating an apple or an orange, you are eating a fruit, and you're also eating an ovary. So I'll show you in a second how that kind of works here. But the ovary becomes the fruit. Inside the little seeds, these are little ovules, they're going to become seeds. Remember, the whole goal of a plant is to reproduce. So if we have pollen coming in, fertilizing these eggs, what ends up happening, those eggs turn into the baby plant, which is the seed. So we have a fruit around the outside and then our seed. So inside we have our ovules. So ovules, eggs, they're going to turn into seeds if they're fertilized. We'll talk about how all of that happens. If they're not fertilized, the flower just kind of wilts and disintegrates away. It doesn't make a little baby plant, which is the seed. And then up at the top here is something called the stigma. The stigma is this top part. It's really sticky. And it's really sticky so that pollen can stick onto it. Remember, pollen's the sperm? We need pollen to stick on it so it can travel down here and fertilize our eggs. So stigma and sticky, that's how you can remember it. They both start with STI. Sticky surface that pollen sticks to. So male parts make plant sperm, pollen. It's going to eventually land on the female parts, and the female parts have the eggs, the ovules, that are going to turn into the seeds. Now, the part that holds up the stigma is called the style. So the style is the part that is just supporting and holding up the stigma there. So as something to note, some flowers only have male parts. Notice this flower only has anthers, and stamen are the whole part, stamen. It's got anthers and filaments. So this flower only has male parts. Some flowers only have female parts. Some actually have both parts. We have words for this. If you have this in your notebook, you can, or in your notes packet, you can write it down. Otherwise, if it is not there, you don't need to write it down. But a perfect flower has both male and female parts on the same flower. So that's like that diagram we looked at. The one up here is a perfect flower because it's got the female part in the middle, male parts on the outside. An imperfect flower only has male parts or only has female parts. It doesn't have both. And so in that case, for sure, you would need cross-pollination to happen between these flowers. One example are pumpkin and squash plants. So if you have like zucchini and you grow it in your garden, or pumpkins, you might be wondering, oh, I have all these flowers, but I'm not growing any zucchini or pumpkin. Well, you might only be making the male flowers and not the female flowers that can actually grow the zucchini. And if you don't have the right nutrients, sometimes they only produce the male flowers because they don't have enough energy to actually make the zucchini fruit.